Well, welcome yet again to our series of lectures on the foundations of Western civilization. This is lecture number 30. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the Byzantine Empire. Now, you may recall that at the beginning of the previous lecture, I had said that we would give 3 lectures to the heirs of the Roman Empire. We spoke in the last lecture of what I called the least predictable, perhaps the most surprising of these heirs, the Islamic people, the Arab peoples, the Prophet Muhammad, and the Islamic faith. Today we turn our attention to the eastern end of the Mediterranean, to the Byzantine Empire, the heir of the Eastern Roman Empire, and in our next lecture we'll turn to the kingdoms of the Germanic West. Now, as the kingdoms of the Germanic West were evolving over the course of the 5th century, the Eastern Empire persisted. And again, if we were to go back to some point in the late 4th, the 5th, maybe in the very early 6th century, we would probably predict that, well, this Roman Empire is going to continue having some kind of existence. That it did so would not surprise us, though we might very well have been a little unclear what its future would be. Why then, in the 4th and across the 5th, maybe the very early years of the 6th century, did the Eastern Roman Empire seem to be a bit more successful than its Western counterpart, which after all disappeared? Well, I think we can identify some very basic reasons. For example, in the East, there were fewer and less acute frontier problems. In the West, the long Rhine and Danube frontiers were threatened again and again and again. We saw how the Visigoths settled in the Balkans first and then went to the West. Now, there were some serious challenges in the East, but they were less acute, less persistent, and less contemporaneous. They didn't happen all at the same time, as happened more or less in the West. Generally, the Eastern rulers were more skillful and competent. Now, this is just a piece of historical dumb luck. There's no theory, there's no great thesis that will explain this. The East had a series of quite effective, capable rulers at a time when, on the whole, the West did not. The East was more prosperous. It was more urbanized. It was more intellectually cultivated. In many ways, the Romans chose to take their stand in the East. And this is important to remember, because they chose to take their stand in the East, and they stood, as we'll see as we move along, for 1,000 years. So, lest we regard the Romans as somehow helpless victims of all of these complex forces of late antiquity, let's remember that the eastern half of the Roman Empire, in a sense, addressed its problems, or continued to do so, and persisted. The East, however, also had very, very deep religious divisions. Primarily, these religious divisions were between those who called themselves Orthodox, right believers, and those who were Monophysite. Now, you'll remember, perhaps, the Monophysites were, back in the Christological controversies of late antiquity, the persons who emphasized one nature, monophysis, one nature, the divine nature in Jesus Christ. All right, we had talked about the Trinitarian problems, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and the Christological problems, Jesus is man and God. In the East, there were acute tensions generated by the fact that there were large numbers of Monophysite Christian communities alongside Orthodox Christian communities. So, all was not rosy in the East, but things were rosier in the East than they were in the West. Now, when we come then to look in on this Eastern Roman Empire, we must say right away that no one in the 5th century thought of the empire based on Constantinople as anything but Roman. In hindsight, and of course, again, I've emphasized many, many times, historians are very good at hindsight. Our hindsight is always 20/20. Historians predict the past. We don't predict the future very well at all. We can see that gradually 2 great cultural realms, East and West, or Byzantine Orthodox Christian and Western Latin Christian, were going to move apart. We're going to drift apart. But in the East, they never saw themselves as something new or something different. They thought of themselves as Romans. Now, what I want to do over the next few minutes is take a series of vantage points on this evolving Eastern Empire, or eventually, as we'll come to call it, Byzantine. But when we start to call it Byzantine, we'll see exactly why we call it that. I want to take a series of vantage points and see if we can observe this slow but steady evolution, this slow but steady transformation of the Empire of East Rome into something that it's legitimate to call Byzantine, if only by way of putting a title on it that marks that it is something new and different, even if those people never thought of themselves as anything other than Roman. A first vantage point, then, the middle of the 6th century, the reign of the Emperor Justinian. He reigned from 527 until 565. A long reign, to be sure, and one, I think, which will provide us with some initial hints about the way things were developing in the East Roman Empire. First of all, we can say that Justinian waged a series of wars against the Vandals, against the Ostrogoths, against the Visigoths, particularly those Visigoths in Spain, peoples whom we met in one of our lectures on late antiquity, to whom we'll return in our next lecture, so we needn't tarry over them now. But suffice it to say, Justinian, not personally, but through his generals, waged a series of campaigns against the peoples who had taken North Africa, Italy, and Spain in an attempt, a vain attempt in the end, but an attempt all the same to recover Rome's lost western provinces. We can see very clearly that insofar as these campaigns were not fully successful, Constantinople's sphere of influence was being effectively reduced to the eastern Mediterranean. But the very fact that Justinian waged these campaigns in the West indicates that to him it was desirable and perhaps attainable to recover Rome's lost imperial glory. The imperial administration and finances were massively reformed in Justinian's time, the first major reforms of this kind since the days of Diocletian and Constantine. In other words, since about 2 centuries. We can see, in retrospect, that a new kind of regime with a less civilian character, with a more military character, was emerging. Put in slightly different terms, Rome had always attempted to maintain the notion of a very strict separation between civilian and military power. Now, we saw that the late Roman Empire was in many respects an armed camp. We saw that the early Roman Empire, the Augustan Principate, was in some ways a paradox at its very heart, because it was a magistracy and at the same time it was a military dictatorship. But in theory, the Romans sharply differentiated between civilian and military power. We can see again in retrospect that beginning in the time of Justinian, that separation is being eroded, and perhaps indeed eroded permanently. And it's being eroded not on the side of traditional civilian rule, but on the side of military rule. Justinian issued, between the years 529 and 533, in a series of different books and a series of different collections, the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. A man by the name of Tribonian was the chief legist, was the chief jurist, the chief sort of a lawyer who worked on putting this massive legal collection together. Now, there had been, in the time of the Emperor Theodosius, in the 5th century, a substantial revision of Roman law, which we call the Theodosian Code. So from one point of view, we can put Justinian into a longer tradition of reforms, of collecting, reforming, studying, analyzing, streamlining Roman law. But Justinian's was the last great ancient collection and analysis of Roman law. Now, he issued it in a whole series of different collections, the Codex, the body of the law as a whole, digest, the books for the law schools effectively, the novella, which were the collections of new laws being issued, and so on. So it was issued, it wasn't simply one big book, it was a series of different items with slightly different intentions, slightly different focus. We can say of this that it has actually been, perhaps, the most influential legal collection in human history. That's a bold claim, but it is indeed, I think, a fair one. There are some ironies in the Corpus Juris Civilis. It was issued in Latin and had almost immediately to be translated into Greek in order to be useful in the Eastern Roman world. So even as Justinian was looking back to the well springs of Roman law, and what is more Roman than law, what more traditional than Roman law, he is preparing a collection in Latin which has to be turned into Greek in order to be useful. We can see, in other words, that his world is becoming increasingly a Greek world and not a Latin world. So if Latin means Roman, or Roman means Latin, something is indeed changing. The Ecumenical Council of the year 553, which was called by the Emperor Justinian. Remember, the first of these ecumenical councils we met in antiquity was the one that gathered at Nicaea in 325, called by the Emperor Constantine to deal with the Arian crisis. There continued to be a series of these ecumenical councils in antiquity. Indeed, the one which is assembled by Justinian in 553 is the fifth of these ecumenical councils in antiquity. Now, this council was called to deal with the problem of Monophysitism. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that the Christians of the Eastern Mediterranean were badly divided between Orthodox communities and Monophysite communities. Orthodox communities, generally speaking, those who held to Nicaea's teachings on the Trinity and to Chalcedon's teachings on the divinity and humanity of Christ, whereas Monophysites, as we've seen, are those who stressed the divinity over against the humanity of Christ. Now, for Justinian to address this problem is, from one point of view, not news at all. All right? This is a dog bites man story. This has been a problem for a very long time. What is interesting here is that Justinian worked very hard to try to find a theological formula, and when I'm saying Justinian, I of course mean the theological advisors around him. This is not Justinian's personal work. Justinian worked very hard to try to find a theological formula that would reconcile the Monophysites. He wasn't really willing to give up the Chalcedonian balance of divine and human in Jesus, but he really wanted to find a way theologically to tip the balance of language, to see if it was possible to reconcile the Monophysite populations, and thus, in important respects, to unify his eastern provinces. He recognized quite clearly that coercion was really out of the question. Now, as Justinian searched for a formula to try to find a way to reconcile the Monophysites, he basically ignored the bishops of Rome, who stuck absolutely, strictly, literally, wholly to the formulation of Chalcedon, and who said to the emperor, in effect, you can't change anything. We've settled this problem. It's over and done. Leave it alone. We can see again, as we look back, that the East is willing to make its own way on matters of theology. It's willing to sort of formulate its own definitions. It's willing to understand its own history and tradition on its own terms, and, in fundamental respects, to address itself to its own problems. At the time, it wasn't yet clear, really, that any division was underway, but we, perhaps, can see this more clearly than they. Perhaps the greatest symbolic representation of the work of the Emperor Justinian was the building of the massive church of Hagia Sophia. When the emperor entered it, he is said to have exclaimed, "Solomon, I have outdone thee." Now, what's very interesting, of course, is that he hearkened back immediately to the Old Testament King Solomon, who had built the temple in Jerusalem. And so Justinian takes great pride in his remarkable church in Constantinople and thinks that he has now outdone Solomon of old. That historical reference is, in its way, interesting. It shows us that even as we can perceive change, evolution, new developments, we can see them looking to the past, looking behind them, holding or trying to hold to history. Now, Justinian did a number of quite novel things here. For example, he got Isidore of Miletus and Anthemius of Troll, two distinguished mathematicians, to design the building for him. He created a church that is huge, first of all, and that makes nods in the direction of traditional Roman architecture. From one point of view, the great church of Hagia Sophia is a set of intersecting basilicas, a set of intersecting rectangular buildings. One of the chief architectural forms used in the building is the arch. There is a great dome that sits above the building. The use of architectural detail Remember we talked about Roman buildings. We talked, for example, about the Flavian Amphitheater at Rome. We talked there about the fact that the Romans had become very gifted at using architectural details to decorate a building and not necessarily to provide any structural functions. Well, Hagia Sophia exhibits that quality as well. And yet, when all is said and done, the sense of space, the sense of color, it's a riot of color on the inside of Hagia Sophia. Marble stones of greens and purples and yellows and beiges and browns. It's quite a remarkable building in every imaginable way. It is something different. It is, in a way, a central church. That is to say, its focus is really much more in the middle than on the end, which would have been typical of a rectangular Roman basilica. And it is, in a way, with this cruciform shape, this cross-like shape, two basilicas, if you will, intersecting one another at right angles. It is a church that speaks also to architectural forms of the East, and indeed quite far to the East, places like Armenia, places like Georgia. So, once again, and one last time with respect to Justinian, we can look at this building and see in it all of its Roman elements and all of the ways in which it attempted to speak to the history of Roman architecture. And at the same time, we can look at this church and say, this is something new and different. We have not seen this before. This is new. So, the age of Justinian, then, provides us with a number of quite fascinating paradoxes. From one point of view, it looks so very, very traditional. From another point of view, it is so very different, so very bold, so very innovative, so very different. Now, if we fast forward to the 7th century, to take a second vantage point on this East Roman Empire, let's go to the East era, to the world of East Rome in the time of the Emperor Heraclius. Now, Heraclius reigns from 610 until 641. Here we can see, before we see anything else, an accentuation of some of the changes that were evident from the time of Justinian. We can see some of these trends persisting, even gathering momentum. The military policies of the Roman state, for example, were now differently oriented. The great problem that Heraclius faced, of course, was the Persians and then the Muslims. One of the great ironies of history, of course, is that Heraclius fought a brilliant series of campaigns, defeated the Persian Empire, and in the process simply exhausted his military establishment and his treasury, and was more or less defenseless when the armies of Islam came issuing forth in the central decades of the 7th century. But these wars against Persians and then against Muslims taught Heraclius something that his Byzantine successors would never forget. It was the eastern frontier that was critical. It was the eastern frontier that was critical. Now, the Balkan Peninsula, and particularly the northern Balkans, had always been an especially valuable military recruiting ground for the East Roman Empire, and also had been an area from which East Rome had long drawn considerable economic revenues. There was a very, very substantial agricultural production in this part of the world. The Balkan frontier, or if we want to think of it this way, the Danube frontier, was increasingly being threatened in the time of Heraclius, and already even a generation before Heraclius, by Slavs and Bulgars. So this indicated to Heraclius a problem only slightly less acute than the Islamic and Persian problems on the eastern frontiers. That is to say, the Balkan frontier had to be held. All right, what does this imply? It implies that very little attention could be paid to the West, and indeed, in truth, apart from Italy, no attention at all. The West simply didn't matter any longer. It may have mattered only in the realm of dream for Justinian, but Heraclius, indeed, had very different dreams. Heraclius, in the second place, laid the beginnings of the theme system. Now, themes, that's a name for military districts. The East Roman Empire was carved up into a series of military districts, Within those districts, soldiers were settled on the land. In a sense, they were paid by being given landed allotments, by being turned into farmers. And then they were led in local contingents by officers in a rising military hierarchy that went up to the thematic generals, the strategoi. You can hear in the Greek word strategoi, the word strategos, singular, for general, our word strategy. Well, of course, generals are presumably people somehow involved with strategy. Strategy is generalship, you see. Now, what we have here is a very interesting change from the older Roman system, but again a change consistent with other changes that we've been noting. Let me unpack that. We now have a situation where soldiers are in a sense being recruited, but then being paid to live on the land and to be soldiers from time to time. The Roman military establishment for a very long time had, as we've seen, recruited soldiers into a professional military and then paid them with tax revenues and trained them at the expense of the Roman state. Now we have, it would be an exaggeration to say a privatization of the Roman military establishment, but it is less clearly a professional military establishment than it had been before. Still in all, much of the administrative hierarchy of the East Roman Empire is wrapped up in these thematic generals and the military hierarchy over which they preside. So we can see at once an accentuation of the tradition, already evident in late antiquity, in the direction of making the Roman world an increasingly military as opposed to civil establishment. At the same time, we can see an important and distinctive elaboration, evolution inside that military establishment itself. In other words, moving a little bit from a professional military establishment to, again, not amateur, that's not the word we want, but a military establishment which is organized, recruited, trained, led, mobilized somewhat differently. If you were to ask, what was the point of the theme system? In some very real ways, the point of the theme system was, yes, to pay for the military establishment in new ways in a world with much depleted tax revenue, but that's only a part of the story. More importantly was the idea that soldiers would be placed sort of all along the provinces of the empire and able to respond to crises, to problems, to challenges as they came up along one or another of the provinces. So then Heraclius provides us some insight into evolving military conditions in the Roman world. Heraclius and his successors did something else that is revealing. They called themselves Basileus ton Romaion, Emperor of the Romans. Now, you'll say, that's not very interesting. Emperors of the Romans, they've been that for ages and ages and ages. Yes, but Heraclius called himself Basileus ton Romaion, not Imperator Romanorum. He used Greek, not Latin. He called himself Emperor of the Romans, but in Greek. And indeed, the official acts of the East Roman government are now almost never any longer issued in Latin. They're issued in Greek. So we see again an accentuation of the tendency to acknowledge the fundamentally Greek character of the ruling regime in the Eastern Mediterranean and indeed the people over whom that regime ruled. Let's fast forward and take another vantage point. Byzantium in the age of Leo III. And now I will say Byzantium for some reasons that we'll explain as I go along here, but I think by the early 8th century it's pretty clear that we can talk about a new kind of regime and we can put a new name on it. Leo III reigned from 717 to 741 and was succeeded by his enormously capable son Constantine V, who reigned from 741 until 775. So 2 reigns take us really right across the first 3 quarters of the 8th century. Now, these rulers are often said to belong to the Isaurian dynasty. That's a useful enough name. You may encounter in reading, or you may hear of the Isaurian rulers of Byzantium. These are the people that we're referring to, though the term itself simply indicates that they came from one family. Now, the changes which take place under Leo III and his son Constantine V show us once again an accentuation of these trends, of these traditions that we have been talking about with the age of Justinian, the age of Heraclius. Wars are fought exclusively in Anatolia and the Balkans and along the eastern frontier. Italy was no more than a source of conflicts with Italians and popes. These emperors had almost uniformly bad relations with the popes. We'll, in a later lecture, come back and look at those from the standpoint of Rome, the popes, and the people of Italy. The elaboration of the theme system continued unabated. There will be no going back to older forms of Roman imperial administration. In the year 726, the Emperor Leo III issued a new law code, the Ecloga. Okay, issuing a law code. That doesn't sound very unusual for Romans. But this law code is unusual in a couple of ways. It is essentially an abridgment, a condensation of the Corpus Juris Civilis. It's also issued in Greek. There's a clear recognition. There's a clear recognition here, you see, that even the full scope of Roman law, as it existed in the time of Justinian, is no longer really quite suited to this evolving empire. We can also notice a number of distinctive religious customs that mark some fairly sharp differences between East and West. I think it is from the 8th century that it's safe to talk about a Greek Orthodox tradition and a Roman Catholic tradition. Now, it's important to say that at this time, neither side really yet admitted that the other existed. Each thought that it was wholly and uniquely correct about everything. Moreover, a complete rupture between the Eastern and Western branches of the Catholic Church had not yet happened. That'll come in the 11th century, and we'll meet it in a later lecture. And it's important to say that no one wished a rupture. But once again, we can look back and see how things were evolving differently. For example, in the Byzantine Church, priests could marry, whereas generally speaking, in the Latin Church, they could not. Bishops were not married in the Eastern Church, but priests could be married. The Byzantine Church used leavened bread. The Latin Church unleavened bread in the Eucharist, in the communion service. Byzantine monks were tonsured differently than those in the West. In the West, a bit of hair was cut off the top of a monk's head, signifying that he had abandoned some of his power, that he had abandoned some of his maleness. You may remember in the Old Testament certain rather interesting moments when someone has his hair cut and thereby is disempowered. In the East, the hair was shaved off the front of a monk's head. In the East, icons, beautiful religious pictures. Though there was a harsh and yet in the end short-lived controversy over them in the 8th century leading into the early 9th century, icons, beautiful religious pictures, came to play a very critical role in worship in the East. Icons were thought to be not only pictures of holy people, but indeed holy in themselves. They were somehow imagined to possess something of the power, the aura of the holy person whom they represented. Now, the Western Church had religious art, beautiful religious art, but not art that was itself holy. So, as I say, I think we can now talk about a Byzantine Empire as a way of thinking about this new world. Byzantine because, remember, Constantinople was the old Greek city of Byzantium, hence our name. But it's also important to say that's our name for it. They called themselves Romans. Fast forward one final time, and very briefly. In 867, with Basil I, the Byzantines got a new dynasty of rulers. We call these the Macedonians. They tended to be enormously capable soldiers. They secured the northern Balkans. For a time, they even rolled back the Muslim advance in Anatolia. They practiced very clever missionary and diplomatic policies that won Eastern Europe and even incipient Russia for orthodoxy, for their particular version of Christianity. They promoted learning. They promoted scholars. They were great builders. This was a brilliant cultural period for the Byzantine tradition. So we see that this realm that was threatened on many sides, that had to make a series of prudent adjustments to its own history, eventually ushered in a new empire that we can call Byzantine, one that was, in many respects, fully and fundamentally the heir of the ancient Roman Empire. But let's notice a remarkable and ironic parallel with the Islamic world. We have again a universal faith in Christianity, a new chosen people, the subjects of the Basileus, once again a foundational holy book, the Bible, and once again an orientation towards classical culture and, to be sure, towards classical Greek culture. How very similar, in other words, are the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. What the West was like in this time is the subject of our next lecture.